As soon as the British turned up in India, the Indian people have wanted them gone. As you'll know, this took a while. But interestingly, whilst Britain was embroiled in both world wars and fighting for both hegemony and its very survival, India didn't try to rebel. This raises the question, why? Why didn't the Indian people revolt against British rule during World War I or World War II? So in the decade leading up to the First World War, India was not exactly an easy place for Britain to run. Political movements calling for independence, most notably the Indian National Congress, had been around for decades. But now their organisation and influence was growing. When, in 1905, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, opted to divide Bengal into two to separate the Indian and Muslim populations, the Indians reacted poorly. They collectively boycotted British goods, and some more radical revolutionaries attempted to assassinate British officials, which led to the partition being reversed. Things stayed heated, with the more radical members of the INC gaining momentum and thus being seen as the most likely to win India its independence. 1912 saw another attempt on the life of the British Viceroy, but a mere 2 years later, when Britain's attention was elsewhere, there was no attempt at breaking free. So why not? Well, there were several reasons. One, the British had become quite adept at rounding up and arresting any agitators who wanted to achieve independence through violence. And during the war, the British passed an act which allowed what was called preventative indefinite detention, and those arrested did not have a good time. Two, whilst independence movements were growing in popularity, many in India didn't feel like they represented them. But the big reason that Britain won the allegiance of many Indian elites was by promising dominion status to India, which to many there was seen as the first step to independence. The issue with this promise was that after the war was over, it was quickly forgotten about. The British then passed the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the British to jail any Indian for up to 2 years for literally any reason they could think of. So when World War II began, it would be safe to assume that the Indians would refuse to fight, but fun fact, no. Whilst India had received some local autonomy, it wasn't very much, and when Britain went to war, India's viceroy was right behind them. Shockingly, this upset the people there, who of course weren't asked, and thus many Indians refused to fight for Britain. Whilst Indians just wanted rid of Britain, the overwhelming majority saw Germany and Japan as worse. Armed rebellion wasn't on the table because the British had already arrested anyone who may have thought it was a good idea. But as you'll know, many Indian leaders actively pushed for non-violent resistance. In 1942, the Quit India movement called for a general strike across India. In response, the British arrested most Indian nationalist leaders. That said, the impact of the movement wasn't actually too bad for the British war effort. However, the sheer number of people who had turned out in support made it clear that India couldn't be kept in the empire much longer. Whilst many Brits wished to see India, or at least a part of it, remain a part of the empire, in Britain itself opposition was growing rapidly to it. And the Labour Party, who won the 1945 election, did so having promised to grant India independence, which was completed 2 years later. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with the special thanks to my patrons James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, Yuduan Wang, Anthony Beckett, YN Hockey, Marcus Arsner, Captain Psydog, Gustav Swan, The McWhopper, Alex Schwinn, Marvin Kassow, Winston Kaywood, Shuenin, Andy McGeehee, AF Firefly, Spinning 3 Plates, Spencer Lightfoot, Kamoon Yoon, Maggie Patskowski, Remco Heusman, Copper Tone, Jim Stroomberg, Calling Dr. Howard, Dr. Fine, Dr. Howard, Charles I, Miss Izette, and Words About Books podcast.